the bullet that grazed Grace Bennett's shoulder in the dusty streets of Santa Fe, New Mexico territory. In the summer of 1878 wasn't meant for her, but that hardly mattered when blood was soaking through her worn cotton dress, and the man who'd fired the gun was already dead in the dirt behind her. Grace pressed her hand against the wound, feeling the hot, sticky warmth seeping between her fingers as she stumbled toward the wooden sidewalk. The two men who'd been shooting at each other over a card game dispute had both fallen, and she'd simply been crossing the street at precisely the wrong moment. Nobody rushed to help her. They never did. In the 3 years since she'd left Boston, running from a scandal that had painted her as a ruined woman for refusing to marry the banker's son who'd forced himself on her, Grace had learned that she existed in a strange space between worlds. Too educated and refined for the working class, too poor and disgraced for respectable society, she drifted from town to town, taking whatever work she could find and never staying long enough to put down roots. Her vision blurred as she made it to the side of a building, leaning heavily against the sun-warmed wood. The street was already returning to normal, people stepping around the bodies, someone shouting for the undertaker. Grace tried to assess the wound, but her hands were shaking too badly. She'd been in Santa Fe for 2 months, working as a seamstress for a woman who paid her barely enough to afford a tiny room above the general store. There was no money for a doctor, even if one would see her. That needs tending. The voice was deep, measured, and came from somewhere above her. Grace looked up, squinting against the bright sun, and saw a tall man with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that fell just past his collar. He wore typical cowboy attire, dusty from travel, but his eyes were what caught her attention. They were a startling shade of blue, like mountain water, and they held concern rather than the dismissive indifference she'd grown accustomed to seeing. "I can manage," she said automatically, though she absolutely could not manage, and they both knew it. "You look like you are about to fall over," he said, and there was no judgment in his tone, just a statement of fact. "My name is Quincy Dalton. I have some medical supplies in my saddlebag. I have tended enough wounded cattle and horses to know how to clean and bind a bullet graze." Grace wanted to refuse. She'd learned not to accept help from strangers, especially men. But the world was tilting sideways and her shoulder felt like it was on fire, and Quincy Dalton was already moving toward a horse hitched nearby, a sturdy roan that watched its owner with intelligent eyes. He returned quickly with a leather bag and a canteen. "Is there somewhere we can go that is not the middle of the street?" Grace gestured vaguely toward the general store. "I have a room, upstairs." She expected him to hesitate, to make some comment about propriety, but he simply nodded and offered his arm. She took it, grateful for the support, and together they made their way through the store, past the proprietor who barely glanced up from his ledger, and up the narrow stairs to her small room. It wasn't much. A bed, a washstand, a trunk containing all her worldly possessions, and a single window that looked out over the street. Grace sank onto the bed while Quincy set his bag down and surveyed the space with those calm blue eyes. "I am going to need you to remove your dress so I can reach the wound properly," he said, and his matter-of-fact tone somehow made it less mortifying. "I will turn around while you do so. Cover yourself with the blanket." Grace managed to struggle out of the dress with trembling fingers, grateful it buttoned down the front. She held the blanket up to cover her chest, leaving only her injured shoulder exposed. "All right." Quincy turned back and knelt beside the bed, opening his bag and pulling out clean cloth, a bottle of whiskey and some kind of salve. His hands were steady as he examined the wound, gentle despite their size and the calluses she could see on his palms. "The bullet just grazed you," he said. "You were lucky. This will hurt, but I need to clean it." He poured whiskey over the wound, and Grace bit down on her lip hard enough to taste blood, refusing to cry out. Quincy worked efficiently, his touch careful as he cleaned away the blood and dirt, then applied the salve. The scent was sharp and medicinal. "What is that?" she asked, needing to focus on something other than the pain. "Something the Navajo woman who raised me taught me to make. Yarrow, golden seal, and a few other things. It prevents infection." He began wrapping clean cloth around her shoulder, his fingers brushing against her skin. She should have felt uncomfortable, but instead she felt oddly safe. "The Navajo woman who raised you." The words were out before she could stop them. It was rude to pry, but exhaustion and pain had lowered her usual defenses. Quincy didn't seem offended. He finished securing the bandage and sat back on his heels. "My parents were killed by cholera when I was 8 years old. We were traveling west in a wagon train. A Navajo woman named Aida found me wandering alone and took me in. She raised me until I was 15, taught me her language, her ways. Then she died too, and I went to work on a cattle ranch. Been a cowboy ever since." He paused, then added, "That was 12 years ago. So he was 27. Grace found herself calculating, then wondering why it mattered. She was 24 herself, though she felt decades older most days. "Why did you help me?" she asked. "Most people would have walked past." Quincy began packing up his supplies. "Aida used to say that we are all just walking each other home. Seemed like you needed someone to walk with you today." He stood, hoisting his bag. "You should rest. Change that bandage tomorrow and keep it clean. If you start to run a fever, find a doctor." He was leaving. Of course he was leaving. Grace had learned not to expect anything more than momentary kindness from the world. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. Quincy paused at the door, his hand on the frame. "Are you going to be all right? Do you have someone who can check on you?" "I will be fine," Grace said automatically. He studied her for a long moment, those blue eyes seeing too much. "You are alone here." It wasn't a question, but Grace answered anyway. "I am alone everywhere." Something flickered in Quincy's expression, something that looked almost like recognition. "I know that feeling," he said quietly. Then he seemed to make a decision. "I am staying at the boarding house on Main Street for a few days while my horse rests. If you need anything, you can find me there." After he left, Grace lay back on the bed, her shoulder throbbing but bearable. She stared at the ceiling, thinking about blue eyes and gentle hands and the way Quincy Dalton had looked at her like she was a person worth helping. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her that way. She told herself not to think about him. He'd be gone in a few days, and she'd probably never see him again. That was how her life worked. People came and went like tumbleweeds, and she remained fundamentally alone. But when she finally slept, she dreamed of mountain water and steady hands. Grace woke the next morning to find her shoulder stiff and aching but not infected, which felt like a small miracle. She changed the bandage carefully, noting that Quincy had left several clean cloths and the jar of salve on her washstand. She hadn't even noticed him setting them down. The seamstress shop where she worked was run by Mrs. Velasquez, a stern woman who expected punctuality and perfection. Grace knew she should go to work despite her injury, but when she tried to lift her arm, pain shot through her shoulder sharp enough to make her gasp. There was no way she could manage the fine needlework required. She made her way downstairs to explain to the shop owner, Mr. Henderson, who listened with the same disinterested expression he wore for everything, and told her Mrs. Velasquez didn't pay for workers who couldn't work. Grace felt the familiar weight of uncertainty settle over her. She had enough money for perhaps 2 more weeks of rent, less if she wanted to eat regularly. The day stretched before her, empty and anxious. She sat in her room, practicing moving her arm, testing the limits of the injury. By afternoon, she was restless enough to venture outside, her arm in a makeshift sling fashioned from a scarf. Santa Fe was busy, as always. The plaza bustled with vendors and shoppers, a mix of Mexican families, Anglo settlers, and Pueblo Indians conducting trade. Grace had always appreciated the diversity of the territory, the way different cultures mixed and mingled here in ways they never had back east. But appreciation didn't translate to belonging. She was still an outsider everywhere. She found herself walking toward Main Street without consciously deciding to do so. The boarding house Quincy had mentioned was easy to identify, a two-story adobe building with a painted sign. Grace told herself she was just walking, just getting air, but when Quincy emerged from the building as she was passing, she couldn't quite hide her relief at seeing him. "Miss Bennett," he said, and she realized she must have told him her name yesterday, though she couldn't remember doing so. "How is your shoulder?" "Healing well, thanks to you," she said. "The salve seems to be working." Quincy nodded, then seemed to notice her sling. "You are not working today." "I cannot sew with this injury, which means I am not earning wages." She hadn't meant to say that last part. It sounded too much like self-pity, but Quincy just looked thoughtful. "Can you ride?" The question surprised her. "I learned as a child, but it has been years. I have a job to do and I could use an extra set of hands, even injured hands." He gestured down the street. "A rancher about 10 miles north has some cattle that need moving to a different pasture. He hired me to do it, but it would go faster with help. I would split the pay with you." Grace stared at him. "You do not even know me. I could be completely useless." "You could be," Quincy agreed. "But I do not think you are, and you need money. So do you want the work or not?" It was foolish to go off alone with a strange man. Grace knew all the warnings, had lived through the consequences of being alone with the wrong man, but Quincy Dalton didn't feel like a threat. He felt like something else entirely, something she couldn't quite name. "Yes," she said. "I want the work." They left at dawn the next day. Quincy had arranged for a gentle mare from the livery, and Grace found that riding was like dancing, the body remembering what the mind had forgotten. Her shoulder protested, but the pain was manageable. The ranch belonged to a man named Crawford who looked at Grace with open skepticism, but didn't argue when Quincy vouched for her. The work was exactly what Quincy had described, moving a few dozen cattle from one pasture to another across relatively easy terrain. Grace's job was mainly to ride along the flanks, keeping the herd together, while Quincy did the more demanding work. They worked in companionable silence, Quincy occasionally calling out instructions that Grace followed as best she could. The cattle were placid, the day was clear, and there was something deeply satisfying about the simple physicality of the work. She was used to the close, careful concentration of needlework, the way her world narrowed to tiny stitches and fine fabric. This was different, expansive, her whole body engaged with the land and the animals and the endless sky. When they stopped for lunch, sitting in the shade of a cottonwood tree near a creek, Quincy unpacked bread and cheese and apples from his saddlebag and shared them without ceremony. "You are good at this," he said, biting into an apple. "Better than you said you would be." Grace felt a flush of pleasure at the praise. "I am just following your instructions. You are reading the cattle, anticipating where they are going to move. That is not something you can teach. You either see it or you do not." Quincy studied her with those disconcerting blue eyes. "Where did you learn to ride?" "Boston," Grace said. "My father was a lawyer. We had money when I was young before he died. My mother made sure I had all the proper accomplishments for a young lady: riding, piano, French, needlework." The words tasted bitter. All those accomplishments had meant nothing when her reputation had been ruined. "What happened?" Quincy asked quietly. Grace looked at him sharply, but his expression held only curiosity, no prurient interest. She found herself telling him, the words spilling out in the shade of that cottonwood tree. About her father's death, the money problems, her mother's desperation to secure her future. About the banker's son, the forced kiss that became something worse, her refusal to marry him. The scandal that followed when she accused him, the way even her own mother had sided against her. She said I was ruined anyway, that I should be grateful he would still take me, Grace said, her voice flat. I left instead. I have been moving ever since, trying to find somewhere I could start over. But scandal follows. People talk. Someone always knows someone. Quincy was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Aida used to tell me that sometimes the thing that breaks us open is the thing that finally lets us be free. You left a life that would have killed you slowly. That took courage. Grace felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back furiously. I do not feel courageous, I feel lost. Maybe being lost is just another way of looking for home, Quincy said. He stood, brushing crumbs from his pants. Come on, we have more work to do. They finished moving the cattle by late afternoon. Crawford paid them, and true to his word, Quincy split the money evenly. Grace stared at the coins in her hand, more than she would have made in a week of sewing. This is too much, she protested. You did most of the work. We agreed to split it, Quincy said firmly. Besides, you earned it. They rode back to Santa Fe as the sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Grace felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest, and it took her a moment to identify it as contentment. For one day, she had been useful. She had worked alongside someone who treated her as an equal. She had felt, for just a few hours, like she belonged somewhere. When they reached the livery, Quincy helped her down from the horse, his hands steadying her. They stood there for a moment, close enough that Grace could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes, the lines at the corners from squinting into the sun. Thank you, she said, for today, for giving me a chance. Thank you for the help, Quincy replied. His hands were still on her waist, and neither of them seemed inclined to step back. I am supposed to leave tomorrow, head up to Colorado for a job, but I was thinking I might stay in Santa Fe a bit longer. Grace's heart did something complicated in her chest. Why? Quincy smiled, a slow, warm expression that transformed his face. Still figuring that out. Over the next 2 weeks, Quincy found reasons to stay. There was always another odd job, another rancher who needed help, and he always asked Grace if she wanted to come along. She went every time, leaving notes for Mrs. Velasquez that she had found other work. The seamstress sent back a curt message that she needn't bother returning. Grace should have been worried about losing her steady employment, such as it was. Instead, she felt liberated. The work with Quincy was unpredictable, but satisfying. Some days they moved cattle. Other days they repaired fences or helped break horses or delivered supplies to remote homesteads. Quincy taught her things as they worked, sharing the knowledge Aida had given him about reading the land, understanding animals, moving through the world with awareness and respect. They talked while they worked, long, rambling conversations that ranged across everything and nothing. Grace learned that Quincy had never been to a city, that he could speak Navajo and Spanish, but struggled with reading English. She told him about the books she loved, the way stories had been her escape when real life became too much. He listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he was really hearing her. In the evenings, they sometimes ate dinner together at a small Mexican restaurant near the plaza, or walked through the streets as the air cooled. Quincy was always respectful, always proper, but there was an awareness building between them, a magnetic pull that grew stronger every day. Grace knew she was being foolish. She knew that this, like everything in her life, was temporary. Quincy would leave eventually. He was a drifter, same as her, and drifters didn't stay. But for the first time in 3 years, she let herself stop thinking about what came next and just existed in the present moment. One evening, nearly 3 weeks after they'd met, they were sitting on the edge of the plaza watching the sun set. Grace's shoulder had healed completely, leaving only a small scar. Quincy had checked it regularly, his touch always gentle, always careful. "Tell me about Aida," Grace said. Quincy had mentioned her often, but had never gone into detail about his years with the Navajo. Quincy was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "She was the strongest person I ever knew. She had lost her own children to a raid years before she found me, and I think she saw saving me as a way to heal that wound. She taught me that family is not always blood. That home is not a place but a feeling. That the only way to survive loss is to keep opening your heart anyway, even when it is terrifying." "Do you think she was right?" Grace asked. "About opening your heart?" Quincy turned to look at her, and there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "I am starting to." The air between them felt charged, electric. Grace knew that if she leaned forward, Quincy would kiss her. She could see it in the way he was looking at her mouth, the tension in his shoulders. But before either of them could move, a group of rowdy cowboys stumbled past, shouting and laughing, and the moment broke. Quincy stood, offering his hand to help Grace up. "I should walk you home." They walked in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, full of things unsaid but understood. At the door to the general store, Quincy paused. "I got a telegram today," he said. "From the ranch in Colorado. They need me to start within the week." Grace felt her heart sink but forced her expression to remain neutral. Of course. She'd known this was coming. "That is good, steady work." "Come with me," Quincy said abruptly. "To Colorado. Not to work, I mean. You could if you wanted, but just to come, to see if maybe there is something there worth staying for." Grace stared at him. "Quincy, we have known each other for 3 weeks. I know, it is crazy. But Grace, I have been drifting for 12 years, and I have never once wanted to stay anywhere. Never felt like anywhere could be home. And then I met you, and suddenly I am making up reasons not to leave Santa Fe, New Mexico territory, which is hot as hell and dusty as the devil." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "I am not saying I have all the answers. I am not even sure what I am saying. I just know that when I think about leaving without you, everything feels wrong." Grace's mind was racing. This was foolish, reckless, exactly the kind of impulsive decision that had gotten her into trouble before. But this felt different. Quincy felt different. "I do not have much money," she said slowly. "I cannot pay my own way. I am not asking you to. I have savings. The job in Colorado pays well." Quincy stepped closer. "I am not asking you to marry me or make any promises. I am just asking you to take a chance. See where this goes. If it does not work out, I will make sure you have enough money to go wherever you want." It was a terrible idea. Grace knew it was a terrible idea. But when she looked at Quincy, at his honest blue eyes and his open expression, she realized that she had already made her decision. She had made it the moment he'd knelt beside her bed and tended her wound with gentle hands. Maybe even before that, in the split second when he'd stopped to help a wounded stranger in the street. "All right," she said. "I will come with you." Quincy's face broke into a grin, genuine and delighted. "Really, really. But I have conditions. I want to work, earn my own way as much as possible. And I want us to take this slowly, get to know each other properly. No rushing into anything." "Agreed," Quincy said immediately. Then, more softly, "Can I kiss you?" Grace's heart was hammering, but she nodded. Quincy cupped her face gently in his calloused hands and kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise. It was nothing like the forced kiss that had ruined her in Boston. This was a question and an answer, a beginning rather than an ending. When they broke apart, Grace was smiling. "When do we leave?" They left Santa Fe 3 days later, heading north toward Colorado. Grace had sold what few possessions she couldn't carry, packed her belongings into a single trunk that Quincy secured to a pack horse. They rode side by side, taking their time, camping under the stars. Those nights around the campfire, Grace learned more about Quincy. He told her about the ranch where he'd worked after leaving the Navajo, the hard years learning the cowboy trade. About the other drifters he'd met, men running from the war or the law or their own pasts. About the wild beauty of the West, the way it could be brutal and generous in the same breath. Grace shared her own stories, the good memories of her childhood before everything fell apart. Her father teaching her to read, the smell of her mother's rose garden, the first time she'd successfully finished a complicated embroidery pattern. She talked about the books she'd loved, reciting passages from memory when Quincy asked. He listened like every word mattered, and maybe to him, they did. They crossed into Colorado territory after a week of travel, the landscape changing from desert to mountains. The ranch where Quincy would be working was in the valley near a town called Unionville, a small settlement that existed primarily to service the ranches and mines in the area. The ranch itself was sprawling, thousands of acres owned by a man named Thomas Crawford, no relation to the rancher in New Mexico. Crawford was in his 50s, weathered and gruff, but he shook Grace's hand when Quincy introduced her and didn't ask uncomfortable questions about their relationship. "I do not have much in the way of women's work," Crawford said. "But if you are handy with horses like Quincy says, you can help in the stables. Pay is fair, and there is a cabin you two can use." Grace glanced at Quincy, who looked carefully neutral. "Separate sleeping areas?" She asked Crawford directly. The rancher raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Cabin has 2 rooms. What you do with them is your business, long as the work gets done." The cabin was small but sturdy, built of logs with a stone fireplace and those 2 separate rooms Crawford had mentioned. There was a main living area with a kitchen, and the 2 bedrooms branched off it. Simple furniture, worn but functional. To Grace, who had been living in a single rented room, it felt like a palace. "I will take the smaller room," Quincy said, setting down her trunk. "You should have the one with the bigger window." They settled into a routine over the following weeks. Quincy worked with the cattle while Grace helped in the stables and gradually took on other tasks around the ranch. She had a way with the horses, a gentleness that calmed even the most skittish animals. Crawford's wife, Margaret, a kind woman with silver hair and laugh lines, taught Grace how to make proper sourdough bread and preserve vegetables. She never asked about Grace's past or why she and Quincy had separate bedrooms, just accepted their presence. In the evenings, Quincy and Grace would cook dinner together, then sit by the fire. Quincy was teaching Grace to play poker, while she was teaching him to read better. They would practice with her books, Quincy sounding out words while Grace patiently corrected and encouraged. "You are a good teacher," Quincy said one night, stumbling through a passage from a novel about adventure on the high seas. "You are a good student," Grace replied. "You pick things up quickly." "I am motivated," Quincy said, looking up from the page to meet her eyes. "I want to be able to read your favorite stories, understand what you love about them." Grace felt warmth spread through her chest. "That might be the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me." Quincy set the book down. They were sitting close together on the old sofa, the fire crackling beside them. "Grace, I know we said we would take this slow, and we can as slow as you need. But I need you to know that it is not temporary for me. I am not going anywhere." "How can you be sure?" Grace asked quietly. "You barely know me." "I know enough. I know you are brave and strong and kind. I know you work hard and do not complain. I know you laugh at my terrible jokes, and you are patient when I cannot read a word. I know that when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I think about is whether you are awake yet, if you want coffee, if I will get to see you smile." Quincy reached for her hand. "I know that before I met you, I was just existing. Now I am living." Grace felt tears slip down her cheeks. "I love you," she said, the words escaping before she could think better of them. "I think I have loved you since you knelt beside my bed and fixed my shoulder like it mattered, like I mattered." "You do matter," Quincy said fiercely. "You matter more than anything." He kissed her then, deeper than before, and Grace felt something inside her finally settle. This was home. Not the cabin, not Colorado, but this. Quincy's arms around her, his heart beating against hers, the certainty that she was finally where she belonged. They spent that night talking until dawn, wrapped in each other's arms on the sofa, planning a future together. Quincy wanted to eventually have his own ranch, something small that they could build together. Grace loved the idea, could picture it clearly. A little house, some cattle, horses, a garden, a life they made with their own hands. "Will you marry me?" Quincy asked as the sun was rising, painting the sky pink and gold. "Yes," Grace said without hesitation. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married a month later in Unionville's small church, with Crawford and Margaret standing as witnesses. Grace wore a simple blue dress she'd sewn herself, and Quincy wore his best shirt and a nervous smile. The preacher was a circuit rider who only came through once a month, and he performed the ceremony with cheerful efficiency. Grace had expected the wedding to feel frightening, given her past, but standing beside Quincy, promising to love and honor him, felt like the most natural thing in the world. This wasn't a prison sentence. This was freedom. Their wedding night was tender and careful, Quincy constantly checking to make sure Grace was comfortable, that she wanted this. She did. She wanted all of it, wanted him, wanted the life they were building together. The next 2 years passed in a blur of hard work and deep happiness. Grace had never known that life could be this way, that she could wake up every morning excited for the day ahead. She and Quincy worked side by side on the Crawford ranch, saving their money carefully. Crawford grew to depend on them, eventually offering to sell them a portion of his land when he decided to scale back his operation. They bought 200 acres with a creek running through it and started building their own ranch. It was exhausting work, but they did it together. Quincy taught Grace how to build fences and break horses, while Grace managed their finances and gradually built up a small business selling her needlework in town. The women of Unionville appreciated fine embroidery, and Grace found herself with more commissions than she could handle. Their house started as a simple one-room cabin that they built with their own hands, but they added to it over time. A bedroom, then another, a proper kitchen, a porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sun set over the mountains. Grace made friends in Unionville, something she'd never really had before. Margaret Crawford was a constant presence, and there were other ranch wives who welcomed her into their circle. For the first time, Grace felt part of a community. She was no longer the outsider, the ruined woman, the one who didn't belong. She was Mrs. Dalton, Quincy's wife, a respected member of the town. In the spring of 1881, Grace realized she was pregnant. She told Quincy while they were mending a fence line, unable to wait for a more romantic moment. He dropped the hammer he'd been holding and swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she was laughing and dizzy. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, like he couldn't quite believe it. "We are going to be parents." Grace was terrified and thrilled in equal measure. She'd never really thought about being a mother, had assumed after everything that happened in Boston that she would never have the chance. But now, carrying Quincy's child, she felt a fierce protective love already growing. The pregnancy was difficult. Grace was sick for months, could barely keep food down. Margaret checked on her daily, bringing broths and teas, offering advice and comfort. Quincy was attentive to the point of being overbearing, constantly worried, but Grace found his concern endearing rather than annoying. Their son was born in January of 1882, during a snowstorm that made getting the midwife from town nearly impossible. In the end, it was just Grace, Quincy, and Margaret, who had insisted on staying at the ranch when she saw the weather turning. The labor was long and painful, but when Grace finally held her son, all of it faded away. They named him James after Grace's father. He had Quincy's blue eyes and Grace's dark hair, and he was perfect. Quincy held him with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face, and Grace understood that this was healing something in him too. The little boy who had lost his parents, who had been taken in by strangers, was now a father himself. The cycle of loss had been broken by love. Life with a baby was chaotic and exhausting. James was a fussy infant, colicky and difficult to soothe. Grace spent many nights walking the floor with him, singing softly, while Quincy took over the household chores. They were both bleary-eyed and overwhelmed, but they were in it together. As James grew from infant to toddler, the ranch grew too. They added more cattle, more horses. Quincy hired a couple of ranch hands to help with the work, young men who reminded Grace of Quincy when he'd first started as a cowboy. He was patient with them, a good teacher, and Grace could see him passing on the lessons Aida had taught him. When James was 2, Grace found herself pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and when their daughter was born in the summer of 1884, it felt like their family was complete. They named her Aida, after the woman who had saved Quincy, and she was a calm, easy baby compared to her brother. Grace sometimes looked at her life and couldn't quite believe it was real. She had a husband who loved her, 2 healthy children, a home she'd built with her own hands, friends who valued her. She belonged fully and completely in a way she'd never thought possible. One evening when James was 4 and Aida was 2, Grace and Quincy sat on their porch watching the children play in the yard. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Quincy had his arm around Grace's shoulders, and she leaned into his warmth. "Do you remember that day in Santa Fe when you stopped to help me?" Grace asked. "Of course," Quincy said. "Best decision I ever made." "I was so certain I would never belong anywhere," Grace said softly. "I had been running for so long and nothing ever felt right. I thought maybe I was just broken, too damaged to ever be whole." Quincy pulled her closer. "You were never broken. You were just looking for the right place." "I was looking for you," Grace said. "I just did not know it yet." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children, their home, their life. Grace thought about the scared young woman she'd been, bleeding in the street, alone and certain she always would be. She wished she could go back and tell that woman what was coming. That the cowboy with the gentle hands and kind eyes would be her salvation. That she would find not just love but belonging, not just a home but a family. But maybe that scared young woman had needed to walk the hard road to get here. Maybe all the loneliness and pain had been necessary to teach her how to recognize home when she finally found it. "I love you," Grace said, the words easy and natural after years of saying them. "I love you too," Quincy replied, kissing the top of her head. "Come on, we should get these 2 washed up for bed." The years continued to unfold with a rhythm Grace had never known before. There were hard times, of course. The winter of 1886 was brutal, and they lost some cattle to the cold. James broke his arm falling from a tree when he was 6, and Grace thought her heart would stop from fear. Quincy was thrown from a spooked horse and cracked 2 ribs, forcing Grace to take on more of the ranch work while he healed. But the good times far outweighed the bad. James grew into a curious, energetic boy who loved the ranch and the animals. He followed Quincy everywhere, asking endless questions, learning to ride and rope. Aida was quieter, more thoughtful, but she had her father's way with horses. At 4 years old, she could calm a skittish mare with just her presence. In 1887, Grace discovered she was pregnant again, a surprise but a welcome one. Their 3rd child, a son they named Henry, was born in early 1888. He was a happy baby who seemed to smile from the moment he entered the world. The ranch continued to prosper. They expanded their herd, built a proper barn, added more rooms to the house. Quincy had become a respected cattleman in the area, known for his fair dealing and his skill with horses. Grace's needlework business had grown too, and she now employed 2 women from town to help with the larger commissions. Unionville itself was growing, transitioning from a rough frontier settlement to a proper town. There was talk of a railroad spur being built, which would make shipping cattle much easier. The church got a permanent preacher, and a proper school was built. Grace joined the school board, determined that her children and all the children in Unionville would have access to good education. She sometimes thought about her mother back in Boston, wondered if she was still alive, if she ever thought about the daughter she tried to force into a terrible marriage. Grace had written once, years ago, to let her know she was safe and happy. The letter had been returned unopened. It had hurt, but not as much as Grace had expected. She had a family now, one she'd chosen and built, and that mattered more than blood. On a warm summer evening in 1889, the whole family gathered on the porch after dinner. James, now 7, was telling an elaborate story about a snake he'd seen, while Aida listened with wide eyes. Henry toddled between Quincy's legs, demanding to be picked up. Grace sat in her rocking chair, mending one of James's shirts that had torn on a fence, and felt peace settle over her like a blanket. "Tell us about how you met Mama," Aida said suddenly, interrupting James's snake story. It was a request the children made often, never seeming to tire of the tale. Quincy looked at Grace, his blue eyes warm, and she nodded for him to tell it. "Well," Quincy began, settling back with Henry in his lap, "it was in Santa Fe, New Mexico territory on a hot summer day. Your mama had been hurt and I saw her and knew I had to help." "Because she was pretty?" James asked, grinning. "Because she looked like she needed someone," Quincy corrected. "And because something inside me recognized something inside her, even though we had just met." "What did you recognize?" Aida asked. Grace answered this time. "We recognized that we were both looking for home. We just did not know yet that home was each other." "That is silly," James declared. "Home is a place, not a person." "You will understand when you are older," Quincy said, ruffling James's hair. "Home is wherever the people you love are." Later, after the children were in bed, Grace and Quincy sat together on the porch as they did most nights. The sky was filled with stars and the night air was cool and sweet. "You ever miss it?" Grace asked. "The drifting, the freedom of going wherever you wanted." Quincy was quiet for a moment, considering. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of it. Just me and my horse and the open road. But then I come home to you and the children, and I remember that freedom is not the same as belonging. I would rather belong here with you than be free anywhere else." Grace reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. "I never knew I could be this happy. For so long I thought happiness was something other people had, not something that would ever be mine." "You deserve every bit of it," Quincy said firmly. "You deserve the world, Grace." "I have the world," Grace said, gesturing at the ranch, the house, the land stretching out under the stars. "I have more than I ever dreamed possible." In 1891, when James was 9, Aida 7, and Henry 3, Grace found herself pregnant for the fourth time. She was 37 now, and this pregnancy felt different, harder on her body. Quincy was worried, but Grace felt a strange certainty that everything would be all right. Their fourth child, another daughter they named Rose, was born in the spring of 1892. She was tiny but strong, with Quincy's blue eyes and a determined cry that made everyone laugh. The older children doted on her, especially Aida, who took her role as big sister very seriously. With 4 children and a growing ranch, life was busier than ever. But it was a good busy, the kind that left Grace tired but satisfied at the end of each day. She had never worked harder in her life, but she had also never been happier. James showed signs of being a natural cattleman like his father. By 10, he could ride as well as most of the ranch hands, and he had a good head for the business side of ranching. Aida continued to work magic with horses, and Quincy had started training her properly in breaking and gentling difficult animals. Henry was still young but showed interest in everything, constantly asking questions and getting into harmless mischief. And Rose, even as a baby, had a sunny disposition that brightened every room. In 1895, Unionville celebrated its incorporation as an official town. There was a big celebration with music and dancing and a rodeo. Quincy competed in the roping competition and won, to the children's delight. Grace entered some of her embroidery in a craft competition and took second place, which pleased her immensely. That night, dancing with Quincy under the stars while their children played with other kids nearby, Grace felt her heart overflow with gratitude. She thought about the woman she'd been, wounded and alone in Santa Fe, certain that she would never find a place to belong. If she could have seen this future, would she have believed it? "What are you thinking about?" Quincy asked, guiding her through the dance. "About how far we have come," Grace said. "About how lucky I am." "We are lucky," Quincy corrected. "Both of us. We found each other when we both needed finding." As the years continued to pass, the children grew and the ranch thrived. James, at 15, was already as tall as Quincy and talked about taking over the ranch someday. Aida, at 13, had a reputation as the best horse trainer in the county, and people came from miles around for her help with difficult animals. Henry, at 9, had discovered a love of books, devouring every volume Grace could acquire for him. He reminded her of herself at that age. Rose, at 5, was already showing signs of being a talented artist, drawing pictures of the ranch and the animals with surprising skill. Grace and Quincy had built something lasting, something real. The ranch was successful enough that they employed 5 full-time hands now, and they had become pillars of the Unionville community. Quincy served on the town council, and Grace continued her work with the school board. They had created not just a home but a legacy. In 1898, as Grace approached her 44th birthday, she and Quincy took a rare day off from ranch work to ride up into the mountains, just the two of them. It was something they tried to do a few times a year, a chance to reconnect away from the constant demands of children and cattle. They rode to a high meadow filled with wildflowers, dismounted, and sat together in the grass, looking out over the valley where their ranch lay. From up here they could see the house, the barn, the cattle grazing, their whole life spread out below them. "I have been thinking about something," Quincy said, plucking a wildflower and twirling it between his fingers. "About legacy, about what we are leaving behind." "The ranch," Grace said. "The children. It is a good legacy." "It is," Quincy agreed. But I want to make sure we are leaving them something else too, the understanding that home is not just land or buildings. It is the people you love, the community you build, the way you treat others. I want them to know that belonging is something you create, not something you find. Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. You are a wise man, Quincy Dalton. I had a good teacher, Quincy said. Aida taught me that, and then you taught me all over again. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the clouds drift across the sky. Grace thought about all the versions of herself she had been. The privileged girl in Boston, the ruined woman fleeing scandal, the lonely seamstress in Santa Fe, the wounded stranger helped by a kind cowboy. All those versions had led her here, to this moment, to this life. You remember asking me to come to Colorado with you? Grace asked. How terrified I was. I remember, Quincy said. I was terrified too. I had never asked anyone to take a chance on me before. Best chance I ever took, Grace said. Best chance I ever offered, Quincy replied, kissing her softly. They rode back down the mountain as the sun was setting, hand in hand, their horses walking side by side. Below them, their children were waiting, their home was waiting, their life was waiting. Grace had spent so many years feeling like she did not belong anywhere, never realizing that belonging was not about finding the right place. It was about finding the right person, the right love, the right moment to stop running and start building. She had found all of that in the heart of a cowboy with gentle hands and kind eyes, and together they had created something beautiful. A home, a family, a legacy of love and hard work and the deep certainty that they belonged to each other. As they rode into the ranch yard, the children came running out to greet them, shouting and laughing. Quincy dismounted and swung Rose up into his arms, while James took the horses to the barn. Aida linked her arm through Grace's, chattering about a horse she had been working with. Henry showed them a drawing he had made of the ranch. This, Grace thought, watching her family, her husband, her life. This is what home looks like. That night, after the children were asleep and the ranch was quiet, Grace and Quincy sat on their porch one more time. It was a ritual they had never abandoned, these quiet moments together at the end of each day. The stars were bright overhead, and the night was filled with the sounds of crickets and distant cattle. You think we will always be this happy? Grace asked, a question she had never dared to voice before. Quincy pulled her close. I think happiness is not something you achieve and then keep forever. I think it is something you choose every day with every decision. And I choose you, Grace. I will choose you every day for the rest of my life. Grace felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were good tears, grateful tears. I choose you too, she whispered. Always. The years that followed brought their share of challenges. In 1900, a drought threatened their water supply and they had to make hard decisions about the herd. In 1902, James, now 20, announced he was in love with a girl from town, the daughter of the general store owner. Grace and Quincy gave their blessing, and the wedding was a joyful affair that brought the whole community together. Aida, at 18, shocked everyone by announcing she wanted to attend a veterinary program in Denver. It was nearly unheard of for a woman, but Quincy and Grace supported her dream, helping her apply and scraping together the tuition. She left in the fall of 1903, the first of their children to venture beyond Unionville, and Grace cried for a week. But Aida came home for holidays and summers, full of stories about her studies and her plans to return to Unionville and open a veterinary practice. She graduated in 1907, one of only 3 women in her class, and made good on her promise. The town was skeptical at first, but after Aida successfully treated several difficult cases, she became an invaluable part of the community. Henry, following his love of learning, became a teacher at the Unionville School, much to Grace's delight. He married a fellow teacher in 1908, and they settled in a small house near the school. Rose, the baby of the family, showed no interest in marrying young. Instead, she pursued her art, selling paintings of the Colorado landscape to tourists and galleries. James and his wife, Catherine, had 3 children and took over most of the day-to-day running of the ranch, as Quincy and Grace gradually stepped back. Quincy was 52 now, Grace 49, and while they were both still active and healthy, they appreciated the slower pace. On a spring morning in 1909, Grace woke early and went out to the porch with her coffee, a habit she had developed over the years. The sun was just rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. She heard the door open behind her and knew without looking that it was Quincy. He sat beside her, his own coffee in hand, and they watched the sunrise together in comfortable silence. They had been married for nearly 28 years, had known each other for 31. Grace could hardly remember a time when Quincy had not been part of her life. "What are you thinking about?" Quincy asked, the same question he had been asking for decades. "About how grateful I am," Grace said, "for all of it, for you stopping to help a wounded stranger, for taking a chance on me, for this life we have built." Quincy reached for her hand, his grip still strong despite the years. "I am the one who should be grateful. You gave me a home, Grace. You gave me a family. You gave me a reason to stop drifting." "We gave that to each other," Grace said. "That is what love is, I think. Choosing to stop running, choosing to build something together, choosing each other every single day." They sat together as the sun climbed higher, watching their ranch come to life. James was already out in the barn, and Grace could hear Catherine calling the children to breakfast. In town, Aida would be opening her veterinary clinic, and Henry would be preparing his lessons. Rose was probably in her studio, painting, their family, their legacy, their home. All of it built on the foundation of a chance meeting in Santa Fe, a cowboy's kindness, a wounded woman's courage to try again. "I love you," Grace said, the words as true now as they had been the first time she'd said them. "I love you too," Quincy replied. "Always have, always will." They finished their coffee and went inside to start the day, hand in hand, partners in every sense of the word. The woman who had never belonged anywhere had found her home in the heart of a cowboy. And together, they had created a legacy of love that would endure for generations. Years continued to pass, bringing both joy and sorrow. In 1912, Margaret Crawford passed away peacefully in her sleep, and Grace mourned the loss of her dear friend and mentor. Thomas Crawford followed a year later, and Grace and Quincy attended both funerals, remembering how kind the Crawfords had been when they were just starting out. The ranch continued to thrive under James's management. He had inherited Quincy's skill with cattle and Grace's head for business, and the Dalton Ranch became one of the most successful in the area. Grandchildren arrived in quick succession. James and Catherine had 5 children eventually. Aida married a fellow veterinarian and had 2. Henry and his wife had 3. And even Rose eventually married a traveling painter and had 1 daughter. Grace and Quincy became the patriarch and matriarch of a sprawling family, their house always full of children and grandchildren on Sundays. Grace taught the grandchildren to sew and read, while Quincy taught them to ride and rope. They told stories of the old days, of Santa Fe and the journey to Colorado, of building the ranch from nothing. In 1920, Quincy and Grace celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary with a massive party that brought together family and friends from across the state. At 66, Quincy's hair was completely gray now, but his blue eyes were as bright as ever. Grace, at 63, moved a bit slower but still worked in her garden every day and took on embroidery commissions. During the party, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, their friends and neighbors, Grace looked at Quincy and saw the same young cowboy who had stopped to help a wounded stranger. The years had changed them both, but not the essential truth of who they were together. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, they sat on their porch one more time. It was the same porch they had sat on for decades, though it had been repaired and rebuilt over the years. The view was the same, the mountains dark against the star-filled sky. 40 years, Grace said wonderingly. Where did the time go? Into this, Quincy said, gesturing at the ranch, the house, everything they had built. Into our children, our grandchildren. Into every sunrise we watched together, every meal we shared, every problem we solved side by side. Would you change anything? Grace asked. If you could go back. Quincy was quiet for a moment, then shook his head. Not a single thing. Every moment, good and bad, led us here, and here is exactly where I want to be. Grace leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, the same gesture he had been making for 40 years. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life together. As the years advanced, they slowed down more. Quincy's knees ached in the cold, and Grace's fingers were stiff with arthritis, making embroidery difficult. But they adapted, finding new rhythms, new ways to spend their days. They read together, Quincy's reading having improved immensely over the decades. They walked around the ranch, moving slowly but steadily. They sat with grandchildren, telling stories and sharing wisdom. In the spring of 1925, as Grace approached 70, she fell ill with pneumonia. For a week, she was desperately sick, and Quincy refused to leave her side. Aida came and tended to her with all her medical knowledge, and the whole family prayed. Grace drifted in and out of consciousness, and in her fevered dreams she was back in Santa Fe, wounded and alone, until Quincy found her and brought her home. She recovered slowly, and when she was finally strong enough to sit up, she found Quincy asleep in the chair beside her bed, his hand still holding hers. She squeezed his fingers and he woke immediately, his face breaking into a relieved smile. "You scared me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I am not ready to leave you yet," Grace said. "We still have more sunrises to watch together." And they did. Grace recovered fully, and they had several more good years together. They watched more grandchildren grow up, attended more weddings, welcomed great-grandchildren. Their love story became legendary in Unionville, the tale of the cowboy and the wounded stranger who had built an empire together. On a warm summer evening in 1928, 73-year-old Grace and 71-year-old Quincy sat on their porch, watching yet another sunset. Their children and grandchildren were scattered across the ranch, preparing for a big family gathering the next day. Quincy had been feeling tired lately, but he insisted he was fine, just getting old. "You remember that day you asked me to come to Colorado with you?" Grace asked, a question she had asked many times over the years. "I remember every moment with you," Quincy said, "especially that one. I was terrified you would say no." "I was terrified I would say yes," Grace admitted. "It seemed so reckless trusting a man I barely knew." "But you did trust me," Quincy said. "And I never took that trust lightly, not for a single day, I know," Grace said. "You gave me everything I never knew I needed. A home, a family, a place to belong. You saw me when I was invisible, helped me when I was helpless, loved me when I thought I was unlovable." "You were always lovable," Quincy said softly. "You just needed someone to show you." They sat in silence as the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Grace felt a sense of completeness, of a life well lived. Whatever happened next, they had had this love, this family, this home. Quincy passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 months later, Grace beside him holding his hand. The whole town mourned the loss of one of its founding fathers, and the funeral was the largest Unionville had ever seen. Grace stood strong through it all, supported by her children and grandchildren, knowing that Quincy would want her to be brave. But after everyone left, when she was alone in the house they had built together, Grace felt the loss like a physical ache. Quincy had been her partner for 50 years, her best friend, her home. Without him, the world felt wrong, like a piece of her was missing. She moved through the days mechanically, letting her children take care of her, accepting condolences from neighbors. At night, she sat on the porch alone, remembering all the times she and Quincy had sat there together. One evening, about a month after Quincy's death, Grace sat looking at the stars and felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. She could almost feel Quincy beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his voice telling her that she was strong, that she could do this. And she could. Grace lived another 7 years, surrounded by her family, watching her great-grandchildren grow. She told them stories about their great-grandfather, about the cowboy who had stopped to help a wounded stranger and changed both their lives forever. She taught them about courage and kindness, and the importance of choosing love every single day. When Grace passed away in her sleep in 1935, at the age of 80, her family mourned but also celebrated a life well lived. She was buried beside Quincy on a hill overlooking the ranch, under the vast Colorado sky they had both loved. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren gathered for the funeral, a testament to the legacy Grace and Quincy had built together. James, now 53 and running the ranch with his own children, spoke about his parents' love story, how two drifters had found each other and created something lasting. The ranch continued for generations, passed down through the Dalton family, a reminder of what Grace and Quincy had built together. Their story became part of Unionville's history, told and retold, inspiring others to believe in the possibility of finding home in the most unexpected places. Because that was what they had done. A woman who never belonged anywhere had found home in the heart of a cowboy, and together they had created a legacy of love that endured long after they were gone. They had proven that belonging is not about finding the right place, but finding the right person, and that home is wherever love is. Their love story, which began with a bullet graze and a kind stranger, had grown into something beautiful and lasting, touching countless lives and creating ripples that extended far beyond their own lifetimes. And in the end, that was the greatest legacy of all, not just the land or the ranch or even the children, but the proof that love, real and true and chosen every single day, could transform everything.